play Two Truths and a Lie. You know this game? So I'm going to tell you 3 things about myself, and you have to guess which one is the lie. 1, I like to put ketchup on my steak. 2, I never got the COVID vax. 3, I don't really care for Star Wars. How many of you think you know the lie? Well, I'm not going to tell you because here's the game I'm really playing, trying to trigger you. Did it work? Truth is, we all get triggered from time to time. But how many of us think to ask the question, what's the difference between truth and trigger? I know I used to do whatever my triggers told me to do. Like once I saw this guy walking along barefoot, and I stopped wearing shoes that same day. I did experience a brief feeling of empowerment from freeing my toes, until I realized shoes were a really good invention, and I put them back on. At that time, whenever I saw something that went against convention, I just joined it right away. I was fresh out of college and adulting for the first time, and I was beginning to question some of the mindsets and beliefs that I grew up with. And I think we all go through a season where we do this. So I moved out to Oregon to get something totally different from my home Texas culture. But just when I was starting to feel I had found my way out, my whole inner world turned toxic and became unbearable. You see, I would be fine one moment, and then the smallest thing would set me off. And I would have emotional breakdowns every day. And one conflict I was constantly dealing with was that I no longer trusted anyone in authority, and I got especially triggered when someone had a strong personality that reminded me of my dad. So I got invited to a group dinner at this married couple's house. And they were welcoming enough, but the husband was very charismatic, and he told a lot of jokes, kind of like my dad. So we were all sitting in their living room, and suddenly I burst into tears. And everyone was looking at me, wanting to know what was wrong, but I could not even speak. In reality, there was no truth to what I was feeling. The man had done nothing wrong. But I ended up leaving without explanation. I look back at this behavior and think, how embarrassing. How did I, as a 24-year-old adult, not have enough control to get through a dinner with a nice couple? I was that person, the triggered person. Have you ever been that person, honestly? For me, it was as if the more conscious I was becoming, the more emotionally sensitive I was also becoming. And it got to the point where I just couldn't handle life. I got very sick. And no matter how clean I was eating, it wasn't getting any better. In fact, it was getting worse and worse until I was living in a nightmare with both my emotional and physical health. And then I would find out it was cancer. So because of how sick I was, I could barely walk across a room. I was forced to stop working, leave the state I had moved to, and move back home with my parents in Texas, which I admit was my worst fear. Because instead of running as far away as possible from the pain that surfaced around my dad, I would have to face it every day. So one day I was lying in bed feeling terribly sick from chemotherapy treatments, and I decided to kill some time, and I came across a Winston Churchill movie. Now, I knew just a little bit about Winston Churchill at this time. I knew he was a British prime minister and a World War II hero, and people quoted him all the time. That's about it. So I thought I should probably watch and find out why he was such a big deal. Well, as I watched the Winston Churchill movie, I realized he demonstrated behaviors I was not completely comfortable with. He shouted impatiently at his female secretaries, and he had this savage wit that he would use against his political opponents. I felt so uncomfortable, I almost shut my laptop in disgust. I guess you could say I was pretty triggered. That was the first time a touch of self-awareness sprouted, and I thought to myself, why am I getting so offended by a dead war hero who possibly saved the 20th century? And if the world saw him that way, how could I think that I knew better? What if, instead of my anger telling me something about Churchill's character, my anger was telling me something about myself? In a moment, the focus shifted off of the person triggering me, who I could not control, and onto myself, the one person I could control. I didn't have a word for it at the time, but I was beginning to develop a little thing called resilience. Resilience is something that the up-and-coming generations, millennials and Gen Z, honestly don't do very well. Although we are very well versed in psychological buzzwords that have become commonplace, and I'm sure many of you have said these words just as often as I have, like, my boss is such a narcissist. I'm purging toxic people out of my life. I'm dealing with my childhood trauma. But even as these words of psychology fill our vocabulary, mental health in America is on the decline. Adolescent depression and suicide rates have been climbing since 2014. And right now, 1 of every 7 women at American universities thinks of herself as having a mental disorder. So what caused this mental health epidemic? The answer to that is multifaceted and complex, but there's one thing that is definitely making it worse, and that is the culture of overprotection against anything that causes negative feelings. As Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff point out in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, avoiding triggers is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, not a treatment for it. In fact, therapists treat trauma patients by exposing them to the things they find upsetting, at first in small amounts, until they learn to habituate. Avoiding triggers altogether can actually make the situation worse. In the same way, the more that we as a generation avoid the people and the viewpoints that we find upsetting, the more power they truly have over us. It's time to redevelop the lost art of resilience. A study by the Society for Neuroscience is fascinating on this topic. The study suggests that by simply applying resilience, we can modify our brain's gene receptors. So in this study, a bunch of mice were placed in socially traumatizing situations, and most of them got post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as you would expect. But a small number of the mice did not get PTSD, strangely enough. So the scientists set those aside, the anomalies. But for the ones who did get PTSD, they medicated some of them with antidepressants. So afterward, they compared all the mice's brains, and here's what they found. The ones with PTSD had developed negative gene receptors, which caused anxiety and depression. The ones they medicated, they saw a slight reversal in the gene receptors, so they weren't quite as bad. But here's what was fascinating. Those mice that never got PTSD to begin with, they had taken the negative receptors from the traumatizing situation and reversed them into positive receptors in the other direction, far outperforming the medicated mice. These resilient mice prove that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but only if you let it. I'll never forget the day that I chose to get stronger after Winston Churchill offended me. After that, instead of using my triggers to lash out against anything that caused injustice, I began to use my triggers like a personal litmus test to see if I could remain strong and in control. Well, I was able to let go of the resentment I had toward my dad. And I started to gain value from the relationship. And now I love being around men who remind me of him. I really do. So skip ahead to years later, after I started to develop this resilience muscle. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I found it easier to accept the things that were conventional if I found them to be helpful. And many of them were helpful, like shoes. I'm no longer the girl who has emotional breakdowns in public for no reason at all. Instead, I'm standing here speaking to you all. So how do we develop resilience? Well, there's a lot that goes into it, but today I'm going to teach you a strategy that will help you to remain present and clear-minded the next time that you feel triggered. And you can do the deeper work later, but this strategy is to help you be strong in that moment. It's called CEO because you're going to become the CEO of your own mind. And it's an acronym. So C stands for calm. This is the first step when you feel triggered, to calm yourself. And whether your tendency is fight or flight, you resist it and calm your adrenaline. E stands for envision. This is where you ask yourself, what would the person I want to be do? If you have a vision for how you want to be, you'll have something to aim for when your emotions are high. And O stands for opposite action. This is where you do the opposite of what you feel like doing. So it's not enough to just have a vision for how you want to be. You have to take an action to make it true. So we're going to practice this together. CEO, calm, envision, opposite action. And I'm going to ask for your participation. So I would like everybody to close your eyes. And I want you to imagine that you're in a social setting and the person who triggers you the most walks into the room. Now imagine how you're feeling when you see this person. Some of you are probably feeling pretty triggered. So with your eyes still closed, let's go through CEO. C, calm. Go ahead and calm your adrenaline. E is envision. So get a vision for how you want to be. O, opposite action. So now take an action opposite of what your trigger is telling you to do. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. How many of you found your opposite action? That is awesome. So eventually, with practice, you will flow through this exercise like clockwork. Calm, envision, opposite action. And as you develop resilience, you will find yourself in situations where it's vitally important. It will affect how you respond to being accused by somebody at work falsely. It will affect how you respond when a family member tries to push your buttons. It will affect how you interpret things on the internet, which tries to push you away from things you disagree with. There is no area of life that this skill will not improve. Resilience will ground you, and it will empower you, and it will keep you from living in a world that just isn't reality. And you will see your relationships begin to improve. And you'll begin to find good from people you never thought you could. But it will take a lot of courage to make this change. So I would like to leave you with a quote. Fear is a reaction. Courage is a decision. Winston Churchill.